story believable was to not tell it from her perspective, but to tell it from her mother's perspective, because that people would be able to understand. But at any rate, I worked on that case for a long time, and that case was ultimately resolved, and we collected, a significant sum of money because there were psychiatrists who were signing records without knowing who she was. There was it was awful, and the case was over, and now suddenly my partner was no longer doing me a favor by having me work on the case. Suddenly I was the star in the office because I had done this quote big case. And a month or two later, I received a phone call. So when I did the first case, I got remarkable amounts of cooperation from people that had been in the program. But people would say to me, but why for her? There's much worse stories than her. Why her? I said, because her parents brought the case during the statute of limitations. It's just fortuitous. But I would ask people, what was the worst story? What's the worst story you know? And I got a consistent answer. And the consistent answer that I got, and in this case I will use the name because it's in Maya's book, is Lulu Corder is the worst story. We know because Lulu was there for 13 years. Most of it spent in the first phase of treatment, and as Nick said, in order to get by in the program, you either were getting abused or you were abusing somebody else. And Lulu was the easiest person to abuse. So she was terribly abused for 13 years of her life between the ages of 13 and 27. So Lulu found me, and Lulu came to my office and said, where do I go to tell my story? And I said, well, I'm talking to her, and I say something to her about World War II and the Nazis and that kind of stuff. She has got a clue what World War II or the Nazis are, because she was in that godforsaken place for all those years where she wasn't allowed to read, write, listen to music, watch television, see a movie, have any contact with the world. Reading a cornflakes box would get you punished. So I, because I'm a crier, started crying. And I said, Lulu, I don't know what's going to happen, but if you want a lawyer, I'll be your lawyer. And then I did Lulu's case for the next few years. And as I did the kids' cases, and I'm not going to go through Lulu's story, it's documented in Maya's book, I became more and more obsessed with the story, which I couldn't believe I knew and nobody else knew who wasn't there. And I felt this need or this compulsion to tell the story. And lawyers who I'd known for years would say to me like, what are you doing? Don't you have any other cases? What's going on with you? And at the beginning I would lie because it wasn't cool to admit that you were only working on one case. And finally I said, no, this is it. It's my only case, the only thing I'm doing. And we're going for a ride, guys, and you got to decide whether you're coming along. And that's what I did for a long time. The kids' stories, during the course of the kids' stories, as the Newton thing fell apart and Newton ran off to Florida, for many of the kids' victims, my office became a place where they could come and tell stories and be believed. And as kids left the program, including people that had been his lieutenants, as they got out and they finally figured it out and came, they would gravitate towards my office. And I would hear story after story, again, each one worse than the one before. And I wrote down, I decided, in putting this together, to write down a couple of the stories. But just one more thing first, and I'll come to that. During the course of working on this case, people started believing that I wasn't going away, that I was really going to work on it. And I got three of the kids, three young men that had been in the program, to meet me at a diner one night in Bergen County. And I met the three of them. This is still relatively early on. And I didn't realize right away that somebody was outside to make sure I wasn't going to do anything or try to bring them back. And then when they realized I was serious and was really committed to working on this, and that I really knew it and got it and wasn't going away, they started telling me their stories. And one told me that Newton owed him, because he'd been working there as one of his counselors, Newton owed him $20,000, but that it would be a violation of his first step to try to collect it. And so he had to eat the $20,000. Second one described jumping out of a car in order to try to get away, a moving car, in order to get away. And the third, who was the most verbal of the three and who I still have contact with today, told me that Newton had just asked him to sign on a form lying about, on a Medicaid form, lying about what was going on at the program and who was there and who worked there, because it was okay to lie because it served a higher purpose. And what he was lying about at that point was, now in retrospect I remember, is that because the program needed a nurse, there was a woman who had been in the program, became a nurse, and lived with her husband. And Newton manipulated her back into treatment in the first phase of treatment so he could say she was the program nurse and work his way through the Medicaid situation. The stories that I recall, and there were so many, Newton would tell the young women that if you didn't do what he said, if you didn't work the program, you were going to wind up becoming a prostitute, among other things. And there was the young woman who became a prostitute once in her life, which was the night she ran away from kids and needed money at the train station in order to get the hell home, back to the Midwest where she wanted to get. There was the young boy who Newton diagnosed with a sexual disorder where people, every hour somebody else was assigned to watch him sleep and make sure he didn't masturbate. There was the woman force-fed medication. There was the woman made to eat her own vomit. There were countless stories, one worse than the other. And finally, the cases, and there was the, as I referred to him, the Hispanic kid who was always on the floor. He almost didn't have a name. When I told people about him, nobody knew him by name. Oh, you mean the Hispanic kid who was always on the floor? And he spent 5 years there with a diagnosis of drug use, but he had never, ever used a drug. And he had never used a drug because when he was admitted to the program, he only spoke Spanish. And the admission was done by other kids who spoke Spanish, who were in the first phase of treatment themselves. The records were like, the kids program were like, and I hate when people use analogies to Nazi Germany, but the medical experimentation during the Nazi period, in terms like it all had a veneer of reality, and it was all perverse and sick. So when the kids' cases were over, I'm walking around with this knowledge. I don't know, and I'm still not interested in going back to doing other cases. I then spent a fair amount of time representing the Fornitz website back in those days, which was very important in terms of bringing people out of the woodwork. A website run by Shelby Earnshaw called Isaac. It may not mean anything to some of you. And because the other programs that were out there, including the WASP programs, were aggressively suing people and trying to force information about them off of the internet. And so I wound up defending those programs just for the purpose of keeping them on the internet. In the course of that, I met this woman named Shelby Earnshaw, who ran this website. And she called me one day, frantically, and told me that a judge, she lived in Virginia, and she told me that a judge in Virginia had just entered an order based on an order of a judge in Missouri that required her to turn her computer over to a program located in Missouri called Thayer Learning Center, because she had been putting lots of stuff on the internet about the death of a kid there a few months earlier. And the Bundys who owned it had sued some of their employees for violating employment agreements accusing them of talking to this website, and they were going to try to prove that they had talked to the website by confiscating her computer in Virginia, and could I help? So I told her so I responded to her email by saying, Shelby, the first thing we have to do is slow this train down and make sure this order is not enforced right away. But I made that mistake that we have all made on the computer from time to time. When we're responding, somebody sent you a message which has another message, and you're responding not to the person you're thinking you're responding to, but to the person that sent the original message, who was the lawyer in Missouri, threatening her if she didn't turn over her computer. So the next thing I knew, there was a request for a court order in Virginia to hold me in contempt for saying we have to slow this train down and not comply with the order. I don't want to sound like it was a big deal for me, because to be honest with you, it wasn't. It's a big mistake to do that to a lawyer, because there was no shortage of lawyers in Virginia ready to come to my aid with respect to that. And so we dealt with the order in Virginia, but now they had my attention. And so I was defending Shelby Earnshaw, but I then got interested or curious about the death of this young man named Roberto Reyes. And this is why I say to you guys that what you've done is so remarkable, because the Reyes story was not known. And they had murdered this kid, murdered him in a boot camp. And I decided I was going to just look into it. And there had been an investigation done by the Missouri Youth Agency or whatever it was. And I decided to call to see if I could find the public records associated with it. So it was exactly like the stalling call. It was fortuitous. I called them, I got to the right person apparently, and I said, I'm interested in seeing whatever public documents there are associated with the death of Roberto Reyes. And they said, you are? I said, yeah. They said, where should we send them? I said, well, I'll send you this and tell me what. Then I said, just tell us where we should send them. And I had them 2 days later. It was like they were so happy to have somebody end the cover-up with respect to the death of this kid. And then I found out quickly afterwards that the parents, Reyes' parents, had settled the case involving his death. They had received $1 million. That was in the paper, but had agreed to a confidentiality order and weren't, nope, so the story was gone from the world. And I decided I was going to speak for Roberto Reyes, because my partner said I could do whatever I wanted to do, and I was doing it. And so fortunately for me, it was shortly thereafter that we all got together in Arizona, and the GAO was there and interested in stories, and I told them the Reyes story, and they became consumed, frankly, by the Roberto Reyes story. And when the GAO hearings took place, the Bundys were front and center in terms of being the worst of the worst. And then we started Shelby and I started a website called Closed Stay Learning Center, which is really a catchy name. And it closed. We got, it ended, and I chased the Bundys back to Utah, and that case went on for a couple of years, back on behalf of those original employees they had sued. So, and for whatever reason, because the story's been unbelievable, because it makes you feel special to know something that most people don't know, and I've known this and most people don't, because I felt like I got it. I sort of stayed with this over the years, and then I've been inspired by Cynthia and some other people who have really been committed to working on these issues. And so now, with the passage of time, I've reached some conclusions about, I have some thoughts about where we are with respect to this and what's changed and what hasn't changed. And I thought I would use this to try to pull at least a few of those thoughts together. And give me a minute, because I do want to look at my notes. here are I guess what I've concluded over the years. Comes in a variety of categories. When you think about cults and people joining cults, we think about people at vulnerable points in their life, looking for simple answers to questions for which there are no simple answers, and yielding to what appear to be simple and almost perfect solutions. And people typically join cults. We think of college kids joining cults at a vulnerable point in their life. There is nobody more vulnerable than a parent whose kid is in trouble. And the importance of understanding that. It takes different amounts of angst to make different parents feel vulnerable. But the common denominator with respect to all of these programs, then and now, is the angst and the anxiety of the parents who send their kids away. And the message in all these programs is always the same. It is, we know you love your kid, and we know you've tried, but you've screwed up because you weren't tough enough. You weren't clear enough. You weren't straight with them enough. And trust us, we know what we're doing. We've had remarkable success with respect to kids just like yours. And if you trust us, we will take care of your children. We will protect them, but we'll be better at saying no than you were. And when we're done, we'll send you back a child who's ready to conform to your family rules and be the child that you thought you had. And if you're anxious enough, if you're upset enough, if you're scared enough, and if you have other kids who you want to protect, including protect from the child who's acting out, it's a very powerful message. Second thing that I know, and I think is important, is the truth is things are much better today than they were a while ago. It's not the same. As a result of the internet, it's much harder to start a cult than it used to be, because information about you gets out a heck of a lot sooner. As a result of the deaths in the wilderness programs and in the boot camps in particular, and the publicity associated with them, and the GAO and the books, and the advocacy of groups like SIA and everything that's been done, the truth of the matter is there is less physical harm being done to kids than there was. We're not hearing as many stories as we used to. They figured out how to keep kids hydrated and fed. And they know that if they kill a kid, it's very hard to keep the program open after they do that. So for financial reasons, if for no others, the programs are safer. But the psychological harm associated with being placed in these programs, the psychological harm associated with being told that in order to survive and in order to thrive and prosper, you have to work a program. The psychological harm that comes from being told that you have an illness or a disease when you don't have an illness or a disease has not changed. In fact, in an effort, particularly with respect to the secular programs, in an effort to get funding from a variety of sources, programs more and more and more advertise their programs as curing a variety of illnesses that you can find in the DSM-4 or DSM-5 now. They tell you that they'll treat your kid for a variety of psychological and psychiatric illnesses despite having no qualifications to do that. And the problem is that when they do that, in order to do that, it's necessary to tell your child that they have that diagnosis, when in fact there's no basis for such a diagnosis at all. It makes all the sense in the world to send a child who's not doing well, who's hanging around with the wrong crowd, off to some other place for a while. It makes sense to me. I see nothing wrong with that. It's when you add the therapeutic language and the medical language to that something becomes potentially terribly wrong. If a kid goes off, music is therapeutic for most of us. Art is therapeutic for most of us. Sometimes an aroma can be therapeutic for most of us. A beautiful day can be therapeutic. And horseback riding can be therapeutic. But the difference between calling something horseback riding and equine therapy winds up having significant impacts for the kids that are sent off to get equine therapy. It's just frigging horseback riding. Music can be enjoyed, and its therapeutic value can be enjoyed without calling it music therapy. Aromatherapy. The therapeutic language and the language of medicine and disease has no place in the treatment of a lot of these kids. And worse, it gets in the way of the treatment of those kids who have actual psychiatric illnesses that are available and appropriate for appropriate treatment, including psychotropic medications. There were a couple of kidding references to Dr. Phil, and my name is Phil. The truth of the matter is that the Dr. Phils of the world, by putting doctor in front of their name, just like Miller Newton put doctor in front of his name, and everybody was required to call him Dr. Newton wherever they went and whatever they did. The early years in my office, I would tell people, you can call him whatever you want here, but you're not calling him doctor anything. You can call him any name you want. I don't care, but he's not a doctor, and you're not calling him a doctor. But by Phil calling himself Dr. Phil, there's a claim to some specialized knowledge which has no basis in science or medicine. Dr. Phil is no more qualified to have opinions about what people should do or shouldn't do in relationships than lots and lots of people that have a modicum of common sense or no common sense, or my aunt, or a smart friend, or a kid, or somebody you know who you like. And this world of people that pretend to be professionals at mental health and have become the equivalent of priests and rabbis and whatever, and give kids diagnoses and send them away and interfere with their adolescence is horrific, and it goes on, and these programs are getting worse and worse and worse about them because they have to use medical language in order to get people to pay for them. The common denominator. Some of these programs are secular. They're really, you can almost divide the programs into two groups, the secular programs and the faith-based programs. The secular programs now are more and more dominated by big money, like the Aspen crowd, and the faith-based program. But what the two sets of programs have in common is that neither one of them, neither groups of programs, have anything to do with science or medicine or the current state of human knowledge with respect to how kids grow up in adolescence. They're all faith-based programs, all preying on vulnerable parents. One of the things that happened to me as a result of the kids' experience, and then looking in a different way at the experience with my sister and the impact that it had on my life, was that after the kids' cases were over, I became involved and started speaking at cultic groups. And when you're willing to do that, I had a meteoric rise to the presidency of the Cultic Studies Association, which I did for a few years afterwards because I found the subject fascinating, and I had a quiet departure, at some point when it was time to move on. But the truth is about the use of the cult word to describe this is that it's both, from my perspective, a very helpful word, and it's a word that in many circumstances is not helpful in terms of understanding what happens and what happens in these programs. Kids was a full-blown cult. The people that were in the cult were the parents. It was the parents that were at that vulnerable point in their life that joined the cult. Some of the kids eventually joined the cult. Nick described his, to some extent, joining the cult when he believed what he was being told. It sounds like Teresa really never joined the cult, in quite the same way. But the parents were in the cult. One of the awful things that happened to kids were kids who years later had gone on. One of the wonderful things that Nick did was showing families who had come back together. It was wonderful to see. It was wonderful to see your family here together, because the stories of the kids who families still separated to this day because the parents can't admit that it was wrong and it was a mistake and that they were victimized or that they joined a cult out of their vulnerability. And in other cases where the kids joined the cult and the parents figured it out, the kids didn't, we go on and on. But the truth about the cult language is, cult is a very useful word to help people recover from that kind of experience. By calling it a cult, you can understand what happened to you. You can use the tools that have been developed in cult recovery. But when we call every one of these programs a cult, we do a terrible disservice to what should be our advocacy, which is keeping people out of these programs. Because whether they're cult-like or not, they're not good. And sometimes when you use the cult word and you call them all cults, it doesn't ring true to people, and it plays right into the hands of the marketers who are trying to sell and manipulate people into these programs because they don't look like or feel like cults, and they're not cults. The world is not filled with Millennials. People that wound up in kids won the negative lottery, in effect, by just having that, piece of shit come into their lives. So I just wanted to get that out of my system about the cult thing, because I think it's been overused. The first time anybody started talking about these programs as cult-like, as far as I know, when I started showing up at cult conventions, talking about kids. And while I'm glad I did that, it sort of developed a life of its own. And I think it's sometimes become counterproductive. One final thought. I didn't work nearly as hard as Cynthia and others, but lots of wonderful people worked very hard to try to get federal legislation licensing these programs. And I was ambivalent about it at the time. I wasn't sure it was a good idea, and to be honest with you, I'm still not. Regulating every program with respect to health, safety, and welfare in every state is obviously important. But I think we have to be very careful that we don't legitimize something which is egregiously inappropriate by regulating it and then have the programs take over the regulation offices, which happens in administrative agencies of all kinds all over the place. What we need to be about, from my perspective, is delegitimizing this whole idea that by sending somebody away for a long period of time, breaking them down and then building them up, you can do anything good. People who are in kids are going to laugh when they think about the preposterous nature of this. But Aspen spent a fair amount of money in an effort to convince people to come to sell their programs by doing a study that looks like a real professional behavioral study by real PhDs. And what the study did was do a survey of the parents about what their relationships with their kids were like on the day they put them into the program, how they were getting along with their kids, and with their kids, how they were getting along with their families, how they thought they were doing, what they thought the nature of their problems were. And they took those surveys, and then they compared them with a survey they did at the point that people who left the program successfully did on the day they left the program, and how they felt about their relationship with their parents. And when the program was stripped to its bare essential, that's what it was. Any parent who's had a kid go off to college and had those wonderful couple of hours when your kid first comes home, there's not a happier time in a family. 2 days later, you're ready for them to go back. But there's not a worse day in the life of a family than on the day you place your child in one of these facilities. And there's not a better day when you think you're bringing your child home cured. And selling that and I give you that example of selling that as a study. You know, the kids who finally got out of kids learned to lie. They learned to do what they needed to do to find their way out. I give you that as an example, really just as a demonstration of the fraudulent nature of these programs and the fraudulent nature of the marketing. So that's my story. That's what I've learned. And again, it's Jody, thank you very, very much for doing this. It's wonderful to be here. Thanks. I'm here. I got.
Anybody have any questions for?
Hi.
I just recently found out about Milton. It's been the past 2 years. I'm a graduate from Straight Orlando.
Okay.
In 1986.
1986. Okay.
Yeah, I was there 2.5 years. Graduated, went on staff.
So you got there in 1983.
Right when St. Pete closed down, I guess.
So it's later. Okay.
I'm not too familiar with
Okay.
St. Pete closed down and then Orlando opened.
Yep.
That was a new one right into Orlando.
Yep. And that then changed names at some point and became.
It was safe after
Yeah.
Straight.
Yeah.
And it was
Sadly, I know this history. Go ahead.
Miller in charge of the program back then.
So he is this. I can give you the dates. I actually know these dates, not as well as I used to, but I still know them. Newton was in Straight from 1980 to 1984. In St. Petersburg primarily, but he was national clinical director, and a lot of the worst abuses happened on his watch and in his presence during the period he was in Straight. There's a lot of misinformation about the circumstances of him leaving Straight, but the truth is, as I figured it out, was that Newton thought Straight had other big personalities in it, including Mel Sembler and others, and Newton really believed he was destined for greatness. And he really, that's the one thing I know he believed. He was a con man about a lot of things, but his own belief in his own importance was very clear. The CEO of Monster.com enrolled one or two of his kids in Straight in St. Petersburg. And if you were rich and you put your kid in Straight, or in kids, so the requirement that you show up at every one of those family meetings on Monday and Friday night, it's like a lot of other things in our society. There was a rich person's exception for a lot of those things. So the father of the McKelvey boys would fly in from time to time. And he became enamored and became convinced that Newton was absolutely a genius and was onto something because he was making his kids better. So McKelvey gave Newton $2 million to open in New York, not New York, in Bergen County. So that was the threat in New York, with the idea that they were then going to franchise these programs and have them all over the country. So Newton, at the same time that was happening, there were all these allegations of abuse in St. Petersburg. So Newton left at the end of '83 and opened up kids in early '84. St. Petersburg closed and Straight went on for a bunch of additional years. But Newton is absolutely central to what happened at Straight. And I sincerely believe, and I may be naive, I may be the fool, Mel Sembler has done lots and lots of awful things. But the worst thing he's done is, after all these years, not acknowledging that Miller Newton was a monster and not disowning him. Because the program went on for a while, but continued to be influenced by what Newton had done while he was there. And I'm not trying to minimize what happened at Straight at all. It was horrific. But calling Straight Kids Light doesn't even begin to do justice. Because there's nobody, if you stayed there 2.5 years, by the end of 2.5 years you were on staff. Kids had kids that were there for 4 years, 5 years, 7 years. At Straight?
On first base.
Okay.
Yeah,
You know, if I showed you, I brought with me, I don't need to show it, but I brought with me some of the exhibits I had at one of the trials showing the number of days over a 5-year period that the Hispanic kid who was always on the floor, that's what I'll call him, how many days he spent on first phase. of treatment over a 5-year period under the conditions that Nick described.
I was on first base for a year and a half. I haven't touched a drug before I went in. They called me a dry druggie. They kept me in there.
Great.
I told my parents that I had the capability of eventually doing drugs, so I was labeled a dry druggie.
Did you have a sibling who was in? Were you sent in
No.
as a sibling?
No.
What?
My parents' friends had their son in, and he was an actual druggie. And I was just, skipping school and bad talk to my mom. And, that's about it.
I came-
Typical teenager.
Yeah, I came back to the Cultic Studies Association last year to do a talk about the cultic origins of these programs and the Kids and Straight program in particular. I did it because I really wanted to get my thoughts together about it, and because the program was in Italy and my wife really wanted to go. and so but one of the sad things that happened as it relates to kids and Miller Newton is Miller Newton was an alcoholic. His father was an alcoholic. And Miller Newton was involved in an accident resulting in the death, some deaths way back when. And he's one of a group of people that took everything that took something wonderful that's helped so many people, and I'm referring to AA, and turned it into something that was a complete and total perversion of what it was by adding coercion and leaders and all kinds of things that had nothing to do with what Bill Wilson, had done. I'm not sure what made me think of that just now, but that's when I started thinking about Miller Newton and what he did. Anyway.
I'm sorry, it's, what time is it?
I'm done.
5:10, and we're supposed to be breaking for dinner at that time, so we're way off schedule. Hey, Phil,
Thank you.
thank you so much.
Thank you, Joe.
Phil, you're going to be here on Sunday, right?
I am going to come back.
Okay, good.
I haven't seen Meyer in a while.
Okay, good. Because I have a little something for you. Okay. Okay. So we're like an hour behind. So if we do our next speaker, and that speaker is for 45 minutes, we'll have an hour for dinner, and then jumping over to the next event. So then we'll be finally on time. Okay.